At the age of 19, Mr. Nguyen was a clerk with the civil administration in Can Tho province. In the beginning of 1945, he joined the Dai Viet Party, or National Party of Vietnam, to fight for the independence of Vietnam. He stayed with the rebellion movement for a short period of time, but left when the Vietnamese communists usurped power. In 1946, he worked at the National Library, sleeping there at night. During that time, the Cochin China chapter of the Dai Viet Party gave him the responsibility of writing political documents and articles for the party magazines Youth and The Vietnamese Torch. This was his most prolific period. He excelled in political analyses and commentaries using the pen name of Hom Nguyen, and in political satire writing under the names of Gong Nhang, Ba Sao, or Tu Sao. In 1953, he started using the pen name of Dang Phuong for his poetry. In 1949, he left his job to devote all his time to his party. He became a political instructor for the Youth Cadres Academy in Nha Trang, where Dr. Nguyen Tong Hoang was a minister for youth affairs. In 1951, he was transferred to reinforce the organization of Youth for the Defense of the Country on Hang Ngang Street in Hanoi, North Vietnam. When the government of Nguyen Van Tham disbanded the organization, he returned to Saigon and taught at the Le Ba Cang High School. In 1953, the Dai Viet Party cooperated with the government of Mr. Ngo Dinh Nhu, several dignitaries, and other nationalist organizations to form the Unified Movement for Peace. The movement demanded that the French return power to the Vietnamese people and that head of state Bao Dai democratize the regime. Mr. Huy served as a liaison between Dr. Nguyen Tong Hoang and Mr. Ngo Dinh Nhu. On July 20, 1954, the Geneva Convention partitioned the country in two. The North Vietnamese chapter of the Dai Viet Party moved to South Vietnam along with a large wave of refugees. When Mr. Ngo Dinh Diem took over the helm of government, Mr. Ngo Dinh Nhu did not keep his promise to the Unified Movement for Peace to establish a coalition government with nationalist organizations and to democratize the regime. Dr. Nguyen Tong Hoang had to flee to France. In 1955, Mr. Huy also went into exile in France and returned only after the fall of President Ngo Dinh Diem's government in November 1963. After the reshuffling of Yung Vang Min administration on January 30, 1964, Dr. Nguyen Tong Hoang became Deputy Prime Minister for Pacification, and Professor Huy was appointed as his cabinet director.
After their coup failed, General Nguyen Khan deported Mr. Nguyen Ton Han and Professor Nguyen Ngoc Huy. Once in Tokyo, Mr. Nguyen Tong Han continued on to France and then to the U.S. He never returned to Vietnam. As for Professor Nguyen Ngoc Huy, exiled in September, he stayed abroad until the end of October when Mr. Phan Cac Chiu took over the government with Mr. Tran Van Hong as Prime Minister. Deciding that the political situation was acceptable, the professor returned to Vietnam on October 31, 1964.
In 1964, the three chapters of the Dai Viet Party in North, Central, and South Vietnam had differences of opinions. The North and Central chapters wanted to keep the status quo, while the chapter in the South wanted to democratize and cooperate with other nationalist organizations to save the country from communism. Professor Huy convinced the members in the South Vietnam chapter of the Dai Viet Party to create a new party called Thang Dai Viet, or Neo-Dai Viet Party. Though the Neo-Dai Viet Party participated in the democratic process of South Vietnam, it was clandestine in nature. In 1969, recognizing that the Constitution of South Vietnam had become more democratic, and that, in a democratic system, political parties are required to operate openly, the Neo-Dai Viet Party, along with some independent individuals and members from other parties, especially from the Dai Viet Party, came together to form the Nationalist Progressive Movement, with Professor Huy as General Secretary.
Through the National Institute of Administration, Professor Nguyen Ngoc Hoi worked in collaboration with Professor Nguyen Ban Bong to establish a class of middle and upper level leaders to manage the country's administration, which covered territory from the meridian which marked the beginning of South Vietnam in the north all the way to the point of Ca Mau, the furthest southern tip of the country. I see three important phases in the formulation of the strategy for his struggle. The first was the establishment of the Neo-Dai Viet Party, which switched the direction of the struggle from a military objective to overthrow the government to a non-violent political emphasis. In 1967, Vietnam had a constitution that was clearly democratic in nature. As a result, Mr. Nguyen Ngoc Hoi and several officials from other political parties came together to form a movement called the Nationalist Progressive Movement. Their first goal was to create a system based on political activity to fight against communism. Another goal was to train middle and upper level leaders to manage the country in the post-war era.
In 1968, he was invited to be a member of the South Vietnamese delegation to the Paris peace talks. The Communists took advantage of the talks for their propaganda purposes. He helped the South Vietnamese delegation develop a comprehensive strategy for countering their arguments. During that time, he also made many trips throughout Europe to present updates to Vietnamese expatriates about the overall situation and the position of the South Vietnamese government.
Dr. Bin, Professor Hui, and I initiated talks with students, first in the city of Besançon, in France, and working our way up to the city of Belfort. There were events where a few dozen students came. In Mulhouse, we had over 80 students, and then in Strasbourg, we had about 200 attendees. After that, we went to Nancy, and then returned to Paris.
In 1973, he was invited to join the South Vietnamese delegation at the La Salle St. Cloud discussions with the Communists. He remained in France for only a few months and then returned to Vietnam. Prior to 1975, Professor Hui had toiled tirelessly for the welfare of his country, earning the trust of the Dai Viet Party and holding key positions in the party. Once overseas, in the early years following the fall of South Vietnam, he tried to infiltrate back into Vietnam and make contact with his former brothers-in-arms. After realizing that this approach was not feasible, he changed strategy. His new plan consisted in addressing head-on the issues of human rights and democracy among the Vietnamese expatriates to build their political awareness and to help change the view of the world from acceptance of the events of April 30th, 1975 as a historical fact to a view of the event as a calamity for the Vietnamese people and a matter of conscience for the world. In 1981, together with the other members of the Nationalist Progressive Movement and many other independent dignitaries, he formed the Alliance for Democracy in Vietnam and was elected chairman of the Central Executive Committee of the Alliance. The Alliance has made contact with a number of people remaining in Vietnam.
Professor Hui never raised the issue of political parties in the Alliance for Democracy in Vietnam, so it attracted many people from the army and from other parties who joined in as members of the Alliance. I must say that, at the time, the Alliance for Democracy in Vietnam was a very large and powerful organization, with strength, solid financial backing, and membership participation from the intellectual elite. For example, the founding board members included Professor Dr. Tran Van Do, Mr. Vu Quoc Thuc, Professor Nguyen Ngoc Hoi, Vice Admiral Chung Tang Kang, Mr. Nguyen Van Ai, and myself for a total of 6 people. In my opinion, in the years following its inception, the Alliance for Democracy in Vietnam was very strong, and all its members worldwide supported and approved the path that Professor Hui had delineated for the organization.
The fact that Professor Hui was successful in establishing such a structured organization as the Alliance is a spectacular feat. He did so right at a time when the circumstances demanded a strong network overseas to support and finance operations within Vietnam. He traveled throughout the world to recruit new members, organize and train them, and establish local chapters. Starting with casual discussions in Germany and establishing one of the first strong chapters in that country, he then moved on to the US, Canada, Australia, and other Western European countries. The house of Mr. Nguyen Vang Thai in Garden Grove, California, played an important role. The friendship between Mr. Thai and Professor Hui spanned over half a century of our stormy history. There, Professor Hui lived, greeted guests into the wee hours, discussed important issues, and worked. It is there that the alliance took shape and the magazine People's Basic Freedom was born. He emphasized over and over with his cadres that in this struggle, no one individual or organization can do it alone. Instead, it must be an all-out effort involving all willing participants. With this in mind, he organized a special committee to reach out to other nationalist anti-communist entities and to coordinate their collective efforts. To gain approval and support from the international community, he used his influence and power of persuasion to lobby dignitaries, generals, reporters, academicians, and elected officials to assist the Vietnamese people in their struggle for a free Vietnam. This effort led to the creation of the International Committee for a Free Vietnam.
About 50 Western European dignitaries have officially sponsored the International Committee for a Free Vietnam. During the opening ceremony of the committee on December 4th, 1986, in Brussels, the South Vietnam flag hung in a place of honor among the row of flags outside, next to the flag of the United States, the nation hosting the ceremony. On the left side were the flags of the European Union and other nations. The ceremony was very solemn event. I believe that Professor Nguyen Ngoc Hui was uniquely qualified to create the International Committee for a Free Vietnam. He traveled throughout the world to France, Germany, Belgium, Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom, meeting with people individually to invite them to participate in the International Committee for a Free Vietnam. It is very unfortunate that after his death, the committee no longer remained active, because we did not have anyone with the stature of Professor Nguyen Ngoc Hui to maintain the unity of thought and action for the committee. It is a regrettable fact, and I think that in the future, if we are to succeed, we must find a way to rebuild a committee similar to Professor Nguyen Ngoc Hui's. When I saw Professor Hui, I was very happy. I congratulated him on his good health, but he replied, "You may not know, but I was near death." I was surprised and asked him why. The professor said, "You know, I was ill and was hospitalized. I was very weak. But then, out of the blue, Paul Venkerhoven from Brussels called me and told me to make plans to go to Belgium for the opening ceremony of the International Committee for a Free Vietnam. I was so happy. I asked my doctor to discharge me from the hospital, but the doctor refused. He told me I was too weak and that I would die if I left the hospital. But I replied that even if I died, I had to go."
The Canadian chapter of the International Committee was created and officially opened on December 9, 1989, on the floor of the Canadian House of Commons, with 3 members of Parliament as co-chairmen: David Kilgour, David Walker, and Howard McCurdy. The U.S. chapter was created on November 6, 1992, with Congressman Robert Dornan as first chairman. The Australian chapter had its opening ceremony on October 15, 1992, in Canberra, with 3 co-chairmen, Representatives Ted Grace and Philip Rudock, and Senator Jim Short. On May 2, 1995, the International Committee held its first international conference on the U.S. Senate floor. On April 24, 1996, the International Committee held its annual meeting on the floor of the U.S. Senate and, at the same time, participated in a political conference organized by the Alliance for Democracy in Vietnam. At the request of the participating member organizations, the International Committee passed a resolution to push actively for the democratization of Vietnam. In an interview on April 18, 2007, Member of Parliament David Kilgore shared his feelings about Professor Huy. The creation of the International Committee for a Free Vietnam is a huge accomplishment of Professor Huy, which not everyone could have brought to fruition. Through this organization, many nations have become friends of the Vietnamese people.
Mr. Venkerhorn came to California and stopped by my house. He told me, "Though I'm a foreigner, I love Vietnam and want to fight for Vietnam." You can well imagine how difficult it has been for me to call renowned dignitaries over the phone and invite them to join the International Committee. But I am willing to make that sacrifice because of my personal affection and respect for Professor Huy and my love for Vietnam.
In addition to his activities with the International Committee, Professor Huy also reached out to government dignitaries, especially former President Richard Nixon and President George H.W. Bush, asking them to pressure Communist Vietnam to respect human rights as a precondition to establishing diplomatic relations or providing economic assistance.
He had extraordinary foresight. He believed that he had many students or comrades within the National Institute of Administration and among officers in the Army. As a result, together we established the private business college of Minh Tri, and he assigned me to the direction of the school from the end of 1974 until the school's demise in 1975 when the country collapsed. If that program had succeeded in future years, we would have formed trained cadres, party members, and comrades in the spheres of business activities to help in the development and economic growth of Vietnam.
The doctrine of the nation's survival is a system of philosophical and political thoughts which Mr. Truong Tu An, a revolutionary thinker and leader, published on December 10, 1938. In 1939, Mr. Truong Tu An published a statement establishing the Dai Viet Party with the doctrine of the nation's survival as the theoretical foundation for the revolutionary struggle to bring independence to Vietnam, which at the time was under French colonial rule. Mr. Nguyen is one of the followers who continued in Mr. Truong Tu An's footsteps. His major contribution was to systematize and further develop the doctrine of the nation's survival into a scientific doctrine to counter the doctrine of international communism. Professor Nguyen's two-volume set of The Doctrine of the Nation's Survival was published in 1964 in Saigon and was reprinted in July 2006, its first publication overseas.
The professor wrote volumes on the subject of the democratic rule of law and about the doctrine of the nation's survival. In addition, he has written many books about the democracy for Vietnam. Democratic rule of law is the participation of all citizens in the political process, and the rule of law means that the law must stand above the individual, never the individual above the law. This law is the law as decreed by the will of the people. In regimes abiding by the rule of law, anyone, even the president, who violates the law must be punished under the objective eye of the law. As he observed Western societies, nations with stable political systems, and with truly prosperous economic development, the professor found that only a regime under the democratic rule of law can bring stability to Vietnam.
I think the understanding of Yang Tap Shin Tong as a cultural theory, as a political theory, is valid today and will be helpful to the Vietnamese in the future. Now, the concept has two parts. One is Yang Tap, which is the concept of the people, the nation, the group, the cultural tradition, what is unique and special to Vietnamese that makes them different from Chinese, Cambodians, Americans. And then Shin Tong, which is a notion of essence or life or driving or success or surviving. So the theory talks about how do the Vietnamese, as a special and unique people, thrive and survive on their own terms. And that will be relevant as long as there are Vietnamese. I think the important thing about this theory as refined by Nguyen is to look at the balance, the tension between the individual and the group. All political theory, all cultures deal in some way with the individual and the group. Which is more important? Who should give in to whom? Should the individual be subordinate to the group, or should the group back off and let the individual do whatever he or she wants? I think the understanding of Ngoc Shinton, as refined by Professor Wee, focuses in on the individual as shaped by the group. So there's a kind of a dialectical tension, if you will, where you need both. And I was always struck by their tremendous similarities between this vision and the Western vision of American constitutionalism in John Locke, which is why I felt that it was so easy for the Americans to support Professor Wee and the Tung Dai Viets, and it was easy for them to work with the Americans, because in both traditions we want to develop the opportunity of the individual. And then I think Ngoc Shinton will be the most appropriate political theory.
While researching the institutions of various countries through the two world wars and the relationship between the superpowers and weaker nations, especially the situation in Austria and Switzerland, Professor Wee developed and proposed the following policy. In order to escape from the control and manipulation of the major powers, Vietnam must pursue the status of permanent legal neutrality. To achieve this policy, the Vietnamese people must participate in the struggle to free themselves from the communist yoke, and then must actively protect their independence, their territorial integrity, and their status of neutrality. This neutralization implies that Vietnam would be organized as a liberal democracy, but must adhere to the status of permanent legal neutrality as in Switzerland, with the approval of and guarantee from the superpowers.
He died just after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism, and he knew that communism was dying in Vietnam. He knew that the struggle of the Vietnamese people against the communists would be successful. The communists had not been able to obliterate Vietnamese traditions, Vietnamese nationalism, and they might be powerful for a while. They killed a lot of people. They're very cruel, but in the long run, they're defeated. So I think the issue of Vietnam standing equidistant today in a post-communist world applies to China on one side and America on the other. And perhaps Professor Wee's concept can be used in order for the Vietnamese to balance the ambitions of China on one side with an alliance with America, but not getting so close to the Americans that the Chinese become fearful and use that as an excuse to take over Vietnam.
After years of tireless activities, creating alliances, and traveling all over the world to deliver lectures and speeches, Professor Hui's health was failing. Friends begged him to reduce his workload and cut back on his traveling. He just smiled in response. Only when he was near death did he reveal the extent of his illness. He had been diagnosed with cancer in 1982. Over the years, the tumor spread from his tongue to his throat and metastasized throughout his entire body. Yet no one ever saw him flinch with pain or heard him complain. In the last years of his life, his doctors were baffled, amazed that he was still alive, still productive, still walking on his own. Indeed, in the terminal stage of the disease, cancer patients generally are under a tremendous amount of pain. He too recognized that his being still alive was a miracle. Only now do we understand. Realizing he was near death, he raced against time to accomplish his lifelong dream and mission. Against his doctor's orders, in mid-July 1990, he flew from Boston to Europe as planned to attend the World Conference of the Alliance for Democracy, organized in Holland. When the plane landed in Zaventem, Belgium, he fainted from exhaustion. When he regained consciousness, he asked the ambulance to bring him to the airport terminal to wait for his friends to pick him up, instead of taking him to the hospital. He was taken to the house of Mr. Nguyen. There, a doctor gave him a thorough exam. She noted that the patient's blood pressure was very low, his pulse and heart feeble, and that all other major organs were also very weak. To alleviate his condition, she recommended intravenous feeding. For such treatment to be done at home, however, the health regulation in Belgium required a blood test and other rigorous procedures. Therefore, as an emergency remedy, the only solution was an injection with fortified medicine. His friends made arrangements to bring him to Paris, where the conditions for medical treatment would be better than in Belgium. Furthermore, he had important meetings in Paris scheduled for Saturday, July 21st, 1990. There, 2 Vietnamese doctors took turns caring for him. His body was near collapse. Several times they had to interrupt the IV transfusion because he was too weak. When he felt a little better, he started receiving visitors and leading the meeting of the European chapter of the Alliance on the spot to prepare for the World Conference scheduled for August. Realizing that his medical condition was critical, however, the doctors suggested taking him back to the U.S. for treatment. On Saturday, July 28, 1990, doctors kept him on the IV transfusion, but this time they were not successful. His veins had collapsed completely. He could not even drink a bit of ginseng tea. His breath became shallow, and he slowly lapsed into a coma. He passed away in the arms of his son, Nguyen at 9:30 p.m., July 28, 1990. Death came peacefully in the arms of a loved one, surrounded by friends and brothers in arms while serving his country. The beacon no longer shined brightly. He was forever gone. The hard-working gardener, who had devoted his entire life to nurture the seedling, fertilize and water the garden of his homeland, had to leave the garden without reaping the fruit of his labor. He leaves behind a rich cultural and political legacy, the political organizations which he founded, and a political agenda still unfinished.